Day 4, and we're going to be talking about what is known as the era of divided government. Basically, we're talking about the early 21st century. You're going to see that the 21st century, very interesting as a lot of the elections are very close. We've had several elections where the winner of the popular vote did not win the electoral college. As far as presidential races go, you're going to see Congress being very divided as well. So we're going to cover a lot of events here in this last lesson of Unit 9 and really your last formal lesson of this class. So let's go ahead and jump on in. So first up, we have the election of 2000. And you're going to see, like I said at the beginning of this, that the early 21st century, you're going to see a very, very closely divided nation. You'd have a very conservative South and Great Plains and the mountain states. And you would have a very liberal Northeast, Midwest, and West Coast. And really, kind of that's been the hallmark of presidential elections, at least in the early 21st century, is a few swing states that are going to determine federal elections. States like Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania. These are kind of the most important states in these early 21st century elections. So that brings us to the election of 2000. Of course, Bill Clinton had served his 2 terms. And in this election, you would have Vice President Al Gore running against Texas Governor George W. Bush. You'd also have Ralph Nader run for the Green Party. You're going to see he runs, I think it's like something like 4 elections in a row that Ralph Nader would win, never really capturing a significant amount of votes. And this election would be the closest since the election of 1876. Al Gore would win the popular vote by about 500,000 votes, but really the election would come down to Florida's 25 electoral college votes. Bush actually led in the popular vote in Florida by 537 votes. The Democrats would then ask for a manual recount in Florida. In Florida, during this election is going to be very, very interesting. They're going to have an issue known as the hanging chads, which you can see in that picture at the bottom there, the people looking at. Basically, the system that Florida used for voting at that time, you had like a punch card that you would push. Well, you had some people that got confused and might have, punched the wrong vote, so then they went and punched for somebody else. So somebody, you might have gotten their ballot and it looked like they voted for both Al Gore and George W. Bush. So you had that issue there in Florida. So I was in 10th grade when this election was going on. I very much remember this. I know here in 2020, when I'm making this video, we're still kind of in a time of a contested election. And that's how the election of 2000 was. We would not know the winner of the election until into December. So Democrats would ask for this manual recount. The Supreme Court of Florida would order the recounts, but the Supreme Court would end up overruling them in this. Bush lawyers would push the case to the Supreme Court, and they said that the varying standards used by Florida as far as how they recounted votes would violate the 14th Amendment with that. So with that Supreme Court ruling, that meant that the recount in Florida was stopped, and that Bush was be the winner of the election. Al Gore, he accepted the ruling and conceded the election to George W. Bush. So you have Bush winning the election of 2000. So this will be the second time in history that you would have a father and son serve as president. Of course, the first time being John Adams and John Quincy Adams. And there you go. You can see the electoral college map there. And again, that Florida making all the difference in that. That's what pushed George W. Bush to 271. And again, you got to have 270 to win. So Bush, what would his domestic policies look like? He would advocate for a very traditional conservative agenda throughout his administration. In 2001, you'd have what was known as the Republican tax cuts passed. 2001, there'd be a $1.35 trillion tax cut put in place over the next 10 years. And then in 2003, you would have a second round of tax cuts for stock dividends, capital gains, and married couples. Also, education and healthcare reform. Again, healthcare is going to be that one that's going to be a big issue. Again, we've been talking about that since Harry Truman in this class. Education, you have the No Child Left Behind Act. And basically what the purpose of No Child Left Behind was to improve student performance and try to close the gap between low and high achieving students. So basically, it came up with a way to measure schools and how they were doing. Federal funding would be tied into it and a lot of different things. Also, you'd have prescription drug coverage passed for the elderly and the option to choose private insurance over Medicare, again, to give more options for the elderly if they were not happy. with Medicare. Now, we had talked about in the late 2000s, you'd have the dot-com boom, and you're going to see that would burst in the early 2000s. That would burst, leading the Dow Jones to fall by 38% and unemployment to increase to 6%. There are also going to be other issues going on as well that's going to lead to the stock market doing well, which we will talk about right now, and that would be September 11th, 2001. George W. Bush, he would enter the presidency with no foreign policy experience. He hadn't held political positions where he had to have foreign policy experience. So he did a really good job of surrounding himself with people that were very, very experienced in foreign policy. One of them being his vice president, Dick Cheney. He had been involved in government for a long time, is very experienced in foreign policy. His Secretary of State, which would be the first African-American Secretary of State, Colin Powell, who had formerly been a general to this. So September 11, 2001, al-Qaeda terrorists would carry out coordinated attacks using commercial jetliners on the World Trade Center in New York City, which we had talked about that they had attacked in 1993, the Pentagon, and they believe the fourth plane was actually headed to either the White House or the Capitol. That one would crash in Pennsylvania when the passengers on the plane would try to take the plane back. This would be the largest attack on the U.S. in history. You'd have almost 3,000 victims die as a result of September 11th. Again, I was a senior in high school in September 11th, so I remember that event very, very well. Now, September 11th really is going to be the defining event of George W. Bush's presidency. Again, at this point, he's only 8 months into his presidency, and really dealing with September 11th and the results of that is going to define the rest of his presidency. So this here is CBS's coverage of 9/11. I encourage you to check that out and the stories that they have to share on there. Again, before this, you didn't really see 24-hour news, wasn't super common during this, and 9/11 would change a ton of things in a lot of different ways. One of the ways that people got the news would change, and especially on September 11th, that day where everybody was glued to watching the news in the country. So what would be the response to 9/11? That would be what would eventually become known as the War on Terror. We would start in Afghanistan. The Taliban, which was the ruling group there in Afghanistan. That's where Osama bin Laden was hiding, and the Taliban refused to turn over Osama bin Laden and his associates. So the U.S. would bomb and then send in special forces and troops into Afghanistan, quickly toppling the Taliban government. Bin Laden would escape into the mountains, and we would later find out that he would go into Pakistan, which was common for terrorists to do that because Pakistan had friendly policies towards terrorists as far as not turning them over and basically letting them harbor there. Another response to 9/11 is going to be the passage of the Patriot Act. This would give powers to the U.S. government to obtain information and expand surveillance and arrest powers in order to root out terrorists. Now, this would be very troublesome to many Americans who worried about the possible loss of civil rights and liberties, where the government can come in and basically tap your phone, listen to what you're doing, and a lot of different things. Basically, it gave the government a lot of powers as far as what they could do in looking for terrorists. You would also see in response to 9/11, due to the lack of coordination, again, there had been some indications that there was going to be some sort of terrorist attack on the United States. There had been chatter about that. But one of the issues that came up in the 9/11 Commission report after 9/11 said that you basically had all these different government agencies that were not working very well together. So maybe the FBI, the CIA, et cetera, not working super well together. So the Department of Homeland Security, again, a cabinet-level department, was created to help ensure collaboration between 20 different federal agencies, the Secret Service, Coast Guard, and those dealings with customs and immigration. You would also have the Transportation Safety Administration be formed. So if you've ever flown before, you have to go through TSA security before you can fly. Today, that was not a thing before 9/11, and now it is. So we go into Afghanistan quickly, topple the Taliban there, and the question is, what's next, or is there anything next? And in 2002, President Bush, in a speech, would single out three countries, which he called the axis of evil: Iraq, North Korea, and Iran. At least two of those should be familiar to you today because they still cause problems throughout the world. And the Bush administration was concerned about these countries, their development maybe of nuclear weapons. He was especially concerned about Iraq and about Iraq being state supporters of terrorism, as well as creating weapons of mass destruction. You'll see later that year, Secretary of State Powell would negotiate an inspection plan with the UN Security Council, which Iraq accepted in order to find weapons of mass destruction. Now, Iraq was, Saddam Hussein was willing to let these inspectors come in, but there is a lot of things that he did not let inspect. So while they did go in there and didn't really find anything, they weren't allowed to inspect a lot of places there. And that is what is going to lead to the Bush administration being very concerned about what Iraq was actually up to. So that is going to lead to 2003 Operation Iraqi Freedom. Bush declares that Iraq had not complied with the UN resolutions, and the U.S. would launch air attacks on Iraq as a result. In less than 4 weeks, you're going to see the U.S. and the allies overran Iraqi forces and captured Baghdad, which is the capital city there in Iraq. That top picture there, American soldiers putting the American flag over Saddam Hussein's head there. I remember watching that event on TV as it happened. Now, later on, Saddam Hussein would be captured. He would be put on trial by the new government that was put in place there in Iraq. Again, because Saddam Hussein had control over all the government, and with him coming down, that meant a new government would be put in place. He would be found guilty for crimes against humanity and would be executed by the Iraqi government in 2006. Again, Saddam Hussein had killed hundreds or thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of his own people during his time there in Iraq in charge. That brings us to the election of 2004. You're going to have Senator John Kerry was selected to run by the Democrats. George W. Bush, of course, would run for the Republicans. Bush would win re-election, and Republicans would expand their majorities in the Senate and the House there. You'll see while this election was very close, you look there, about 3 million votes separate them. It definitely was not as close as the election of 2000 had been. So, continuing the war on terror. In 2005, Iraq would hold their first election. Again, I remember seeing this on TV. People would go vote, and they would dip their finger in ink and then use that to be able to vote. And I remember seeing lots of people on TV, holding up their thumbs, proud that they had actually gotten to vote. They would create a national assembly and select a prime minister. But you're going to see one of the issues that's going to happen within Iraq is that there's still going to be a lot of violence continuing there between Iraqi groups, between opposing Islamic groups there. So in early 2000, Bush would order a surge of an additional 30,000 troops to go into Iraq. And you'll see by late 2008 that the surge had worked. Militia violence and American deaths were down, resulting in the U.S. starting to turn the government back over, starting to turn the country back over to the Iraqi government. Now in Afghanistan, you're seeing that attacks from Taliban continue to grow there as the new government there struggled to maintain power and order. So again, like I said, in the wake of 9/11, again, that's really going to be the big thing that Bush is going to be dealing with for the remainder of his presidency. Domestic policies for George W. Bush after 2004, Bush would push for the privatization of Social Security as well as immigration reform. Neither one of those things would happen. You'd also have Hurricane Katrina in 2005, which would lead to the death of more than 1,000 people and absolutely devastate New Orleans. A lot of people would be very critical of George W. Bush's response to that, the fact that he wasn't on the ground and the fact that the federal government didn't get in there to help out the people faster. Bush would nominate two conservative Supreme Court justices, John Roberts, who would be the Chief Justice, and Samuel Alito. And again, when you're talking about the impact of a president, usually their Supreme Court nominees is going to be the most important impact that they are going to leave, and then, or at least the most long-lasting of those. And then in 2006, you're going to see that Democrats would win control of both houses of Congress. So when we talk about, again, this era of divided government, again, you can see it here. You have a Republican president, and then 2006, you're going to have a Democratic Congress. So that leads us to the Great Recession. The housing boom of the late 90s and early 2000s had often been fueled by risky loans and speculators who hoped to flip properties. There were a lot of issues as far as the housing market went during this time, including prices on homes being really, really inflated. I remember hearing stories during this time that you'd have somebody put their house on the market, and it wasn't uncommon in places such as like Las Vegas that they would get offers $50,000 to $100,000 over what the price of the house was. And banks were more than willing to loan money to these people during this time, even though the house was being sold for a lot more than the actual value was of that. So you're going to see when housing prices start to dip, the housing bubble would burst. Banks and financial institutions domestically and abroad begin to face a lot of failure in response to this. So like I said, it's almost like a correction in the market because things had been so crazy for so long. So for example, my wife and I, we bought our first house in 2008, which was kind of at the top, the peak of the market before the housing bubble really did burst during that time. And I remember we went and saw our house the day that it came on the market that we would eventually buy. And I think that the person had like 3 or 4 offers in the same day. Now you're seeing something similar to that happening today as well. So it's kind of just crazy how the market has almost cycled back to that. You'd also have soaring gas prices due to the wars that were going on overseas and a lot of different things that were happening, the stock market declining and rising unemployment. So by early 2008, it was very, very clear that we were definitely in a recession in this point. You would have a $270 billion stimulus package passed to try to help out. Then you would also have what was called the Troubled Assets Relief Program, known as TARP. Basically, this was passed to help purchase failing assets from struggling. Basically, it was a bailout for a bank. That is what it was. The TARP program was to try to help banks that had all these assets and debt that was holding them down. Also during this time, you would have the American auto industry really in trouble. General Motors and Chrysler were both on the brink of bankruptcy, and you would have money diverted to go towards those two companies. General Motors would still fall into bankruptcy, and the government would help basically buy a controlling interest within General Motors to keep them from completely closing. And Chrysler wouldn't go bankrupt, but they would need that bailout as well. So with this great recession, again, you're going to see things at this time not very good. That leads us to the election of 2008. So again, the economy during this time isn't doing well. People are kind of upset and tired of the wars, overseas wars going on. Again, we quickly get tired of being overseas in wars like this. So that brings us to 2008. And really the favorite kind of going into the Democratic primary would be Hillary Clinton, of course, the wife of former President Bill Clinton, who was serving right then as a senator for New York. But she would be surprisingly beaten in the primaries by Senator Barack Obama from Illinois. Obama, again, a very good speaker, someone that a lot of people look to for hope, and he actually ran on the message of hope and change, and that's what is going to lead a lot of people to be attracted to his message. The Republicans would select Senator John McCain, an older gentleman who is a Vietnam veteran and a war hero. He would select Sarah Palin as only the second woman to run for the vice presidency. Again, the first being Geraldine Ferraro in the 80s. And, of course, Obama would win this election of 2008. He would be the first, of course, African-American elected to be president. And the Democrats would increase their majorities in the House and the Senate. Also, and another trend there, if you look at that map, you're going to see that Virginia would swing and vote for Barack Obama. And that has been the case for every presidential election since. Again, showing just some demographic changes, as well as you see North Carolina on there. North Carolina is one of those now, too, North Carolina is considered a legitimate swing state, whereas Virginia is not anymore. So, dealing with the recession, what would Obama do as he walked into office? Him and the Democrats would work to enact several programs to try to promote recovery and financial reform. One of them, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which put $787 billion into the economy. A lot of that done through public works type projects, putting money into healthcare, education, and renewable energy. This American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, very much kind of like a New Deal type program where you put government money in and basically use it as a way to give people jobs. You would also have the Cash for Clunkers program, which provided $3 billion in incentives for Americans to get rid of their old cars and to purchase newer fuel-efficient vehicles. And again, Cash for Clunkers, it worked in some ways. A lot of people evaluate it and say that it didn't really work. But yeah, that was, again, another way to try, again, to help the auto industry in a way to get people to buy new cars. You'd also have the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. And again, this was designed to try to stop some of the practices that had gotten us into the Great Recession, as well as to keep protect taxpayers from future bailouts of companies as well, because again, that was something that was very unpopular, the idea of bailing out financial institutions who by their own faults and failures, you can say, had gotten themselves into the position that they were in. Now, the hallmark legislation you are going to see of President Obama's administration is going to be the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act of 2010, commonly known as Obamacare. The goal of Obamacare was to extend affordable health care to 25 to 30 million people through subsidies, mandates, meaning that you were mandated by law to have some sort of health insurance and insurance exchanges. The big thing that it would do is cover pre-existing conditions. So that means if, let's say, you need to get insurance and you have like diabetes or some sort of heart problem or that kind of thing, now insurance companies were required to cover you. And this would be the largest overhaul in U.S. healthcare since the development of Medicaid and Medicare in 1965. Now, a lot of people have a lot of different opinions about Obamacare. I'm not going to get into it. Largely, how people view Obamacare depends on their political leanings and that kind of thing. So, yeah, but that would be the hallmark legislation of Obama's presidency. So 2010, again, with the passage of Obamacare and some of the things that had been happening within having a Democratic president and Democratic Congress, you're going to see the 2010 midterms, again, as they generally go for a president, did not go President Obama's way. You would have the start of the Tea Party movement during this time, and the Tea Party was opposed to massive budget deficits, the growing national debt, and Obamacare. And as a result, kind of riding this wave of the Tea Party, in the fall of 2010, Republicans would take over the House and reduce the Democratic majority that was in the Senate during that time. So really what you're going to see throughout the rest of Obama's presidency is Congress and the president would remain in kind of constant deadlock. You'd have budget stalemates, threats of government shutdowns, also danger of the U.S. defaulting on the national debt because of not being able to work out budget deals during that time. So when I say that this is the era of divided government, it definitely is the era of divided government. As far as Obama's foreign policy, in Iraq, Obama would develop a plan to wind down U.S. ground forces in Iraq. And by 2011, you're going to have the last of U.S. forces being withdrawn from Iraq. Of course, with the rise of ISIS later on, ground forces are going to have to go back into Iraq. And that led also to Sunni and al-Qaeda insurgents terrorizing people within Iraq as a result of us pulling out of there. In Afghanistan, Obama would approve a troop surge within Afghanistan, and this ended up being effective. Also, Obama, kind of the first president to have the technology available to be able to do drone strikes, which he did countless drone strikes during his presidency to do very directed attacks on people that they were looking for, terrorists that they were looking for. In May of 2001, you'd have Osama bin Laden, who would be killed in Pakistan by Navy SEALs once it was discovered and figured out where Osama bin Laden was. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama would decide to go ahead and go into Pakistan under the cover of night and use that Navy SEAL team to take out Osama bin Laden. Also, during Barack Obama's presidency, you are going to have the Arab Spring. In 2007, you're going to have a wave of protests that break out across the Middle East and Northern Africa. And it's going to lead to a lot of civil unrest. In some countries, you're going to have them turn into civil war. You're going to have governments toppled in these countries. If you can see the map there, all the countries that are colored there are going to be part of what was known as this Arab Spring. And Syria, you don't really hear much about that anymore. Syria would turn out to be a huge issue. Syria and the civil war there is what's going to be the big thing that's going to give the rise to ISIS within that region. The governments that did not fall during this Arab Spring are going to be the governments that made a lot of concessions to try to maintain peace in those areas. Also, in September of 2001, within Libya, Benghazi, Libya, you would have a U.S. ambassador. 3 other Americans would be killed on the anniversary of September 11th, 2001. Benghazi, of course, would come up to be a big issue for Barack Obama and especially Hillary Clinton in the election of 2016. Now, when you talk about, again, the lasting legacy of a president, you got to talk about the courts and the Supreme Court. Obama would get to nominate 2 new justices to the court, Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan. This didn't really change the ideological balance, though, of the court, as both of them, being more liberal justices, replaced liberal justices that left the courts. That brings us to the election of 2012. Former Governor Mitt Romney against Barack Obama, and again, a pretty easy victory there for Obama against Mitt Romney. You can see about 5 million votes separated the two of them. And again, if you look at this map here, you'll see Virginia yet again going Democratic. Now, Obama's second term, again, remember, he's dealing with a split Congress during this time. So with the budget, you would see budget battles between the president and Congress, again, becoming very common during this time. This would lead to a compromise tax bill to extend those Bush tax cuts. Remember the Bush tax cuts we talked about being 10 years long, and you would see a compromise to fix that and make sure that those tax cuts were extended. You would also have mass shootings in Colorado and Connecticut, which would lead Obama to propose new gun laws and background checks. Again, because of having the split, divided government, he proposed these things, but nothing ever actually happened with that. You'd also see that the Middle East would remain very unstable during this time with the civil war that was going on in Syria and the rise of the terrorist group ISIS. Obama would manage during this time to negotiate a deal with Iran to stop the development of their nuclear programs and to make sure that UN inspectors could actually go in there and make sure that they were following that agreement. As far as terrorist attacks during Obama's administration, you would have the Boston Marathon bombing in April 15th, 2013. And it was bombed by the Sarsav brothers. They were inspired by extremist Islamic beliefs and angers over the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And you would have 3 people killed, 264 people wounded. And again, with this, just showing this, kind of constant fear and possibility of terrorism within the country. Again, kind of starting back during Clinton's presidency is when we started to see this more common and through today. That leads us to the election of 2016. Businessman, of course, Donald Trump would shock the Republican establishment. He would kind of start his campaign, and most people believe that Donald Trump did not have a chance of winning the Republican nomination. Well, he would end up shocking everybody, winning the Republican nomination and winning those GOP primaries to do that. Of course, the Democrats would nominate Hillary Clinton. It was finally her time now to run as their candidate. The polls consistently showed, again, Trump heading or trailing heading into Election Day by quite a bit. And he would end up shocking everybody, including the world, by winning the election and defeating Hillary Clinton in what was probably the most shocking and surprising election since Truman had defeated Dewey in 1948. And remember, when we talked about that, we had Truman and he was holding up that newspaper that said Dewey defeats Truman. So again, this was on that same level of shock factor as far as victory. And most of you probably remember this. Trump would lose the popular vote by almost 3 million votes, marking the 5th time in U.S. history where the winner of the popular vote did not win the Electoral College. Again, you would hear calls for, just like you do every time this happens, for getting rid of the Electoral College, but nothing would ever happen with that. So that's the point where we stop at in presidential history. Like I said, once you get into these 21st century presidents, really we kind of have to be careful what we cover because so much of it, basically the verdict is still out. I'll use an example like Obamacare. We can talk about that, but we still don't have the full verdict on how that plays out, especially under Trump's administration when some of the key provisions of Obamacare have been gotten rid of. So Mention again the legacy of a court and how important the Supreme Court is, especially since that is really the most lasting legacy of a president. So when we look at the membership of the Supreme Court, you're going to see that it has definitely diversified over the 20th and early 21st century. We talked about Ronald Reagan and Sandra Day O'Connor, the first female Supreme Court justice. You have Clinton nominates Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Clarence Thomas, who would be the second African American after Thurgood Marshall on the court. Under Obama, you'd have Sonia Sotomayor, the first Hispanic and Latina. Of course, you got Elena Kagan and others as well. So the court has definitely gotten more diverse during this time. So what is the purpose of the Supreme Court? Again, to protect individual rights enumerated in the Constitution. A lot of people are going to look to the Supreme Court to help protect the right of privacy, equal rights, and rule of law. And there are going to be some cases having to do with that, which we have mentioned some of these before. The court would identify that the right to privacy is a fundamental right in the U.S. Roe versus Wade, which commonly everybody knows as the abortion case, that established the precedent of a right to privacy. And in Riley versus California in 2014, the court would rule that the data that you have on a cell phone is protected under certain privacy laws. Also, equal rights. You're going to see the civil rights movement provided the model that other minority groups have used to extend civil rights. Loving versus Virginia, that's a very famous one. 1967, again, here in Virginia. During that time, it was against the law for interracial marriages to happen. So if you were Black, you couldn't marry a white person and vice versa. Again, appropriately, this case is named Loving. That was the name of the couple there. This would go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would strike down state laws that prohibited interracial marriage and held that marriage was a fundamental right. Also, in 2013, you have Arizona versus Intertribal Council of Arizona, and that invalidated a state law requiring proof of citizenship during voter registration application process there. And again, they looked at this as that was kind of a barrier to people voting, having to do that. And then rule of law, again, the idea that we are all under rule of law and that people, institutions, and entities are all accountable to the laws. So in 1963, you'd have this Gideon versus Wainwright case, very famous case. They ended up making a movie on this. And basically what you had is Gideon, who did not have the means to try to defend himself in court. He would end up as a prisoner. He would actually write letters to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court would get his letter, and they would decide to actually rule on his case. And in that case, they ruled that states had to provide counsel for needy defendants charged with serious offenses. In 2001, again, we're talking about rule of law. Snyder versus Phelps. If you've ever heard of Westboro Baptist Church, they're pretty terrible people. They go around, they protest military funerals and protest in a lot of different ways. You can see the signs there that they hold up. And I think one of these military families actually sued them. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled actually in their favor and said, look, what they might say is terrible. We might detest what they say and what they do, but they are protected under the First Amendment just like anybody else. They're protected under that free speech clause. So, again, talking about the court, you're going to see the Roberts Court. Again, he is who is Chief Justice of the Supreme Court right now. Here's some key cases that he has done. District of Columbia versus Heller. This ruled the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to a firearm unconnected with having to serve in a militia. Citizens United, that is a decision which ruled that corporations were legal persons and could buy ads to influence national political elections. You'd have National Federation of Independent Business versus Sabellis that ruled that Obamacare requirements for purchasing insurance were constitutional under taxing powers. And then Ujerfel versus Hodges, which ruled that the right to marriage is guaranteed to same-sex couples. So you're going to see just in Roberts' short time in there that there have been some very, very important key cases ruled on during his time in the judiciary. And you're also going to see with the judiciary, this is why people look at the judiciary as so important. It's because they kind of are the final say on laws and what is happening with laws. Now, lastly here, just talking about quickly how the federal government affects the economy. Again, when we're talking about the economy and presidential policy, you're going to see the government has two different ways that they try to keep a healthy economy, which means full employment, which is 5% or below, and low inflation through monetary policy, which is controlled by the Federal Reserve, and then fiscal policy, which is done by the president and Congress. Now, the Federal Reserve, they influence the money supply. They can increase and decrease, again, to control inflation or deflation. And they try to do things such as adjusting interest rate and that sort of stuff to promote sustainable economic growth. And then, of course, the president and budget, they control taxing and spending and determining what they can best do to help influence our economy as well. So that brings us really to the end of this course. Here, again, as I said, when we talk about these final things, it really is kind of a lot of information all thrown in together there. So hopefully it's not too overwhelming for you. Again, when you see on the AP exam, they tend to not ask very much. This last unit here is usually only around 5% of the exam. So yeah, you normally don't see very much with this final unit unless you are talking about Reagan. So it's been a pleasure getting to go through all of this with you, and I hope you have a great day.